This is the Spirit and Wellness Show. News and information from a higher perspective. With your host, Harry Wilkinson.
Hello, yes, this is your host, Harry Wilkinson, and welcome to the Spirit and Wellness Show. This is the show where we take a look at the days and weeks, events, happenings around the world, in entertainment, in politics, in technology, everything that we hear about, everything that affects us, every story, well, not every story, but stories that we interact with on a daily basis through our social media, our new media platforms, our traditional media platforms, whatever it is. We take a step back and we look at these situations, we look at these stories from a higher perspective. And from a higher perspective, of course, you know what I mean. If you've listened to this show before, you know what I mean by a higher perspective. That's a perspective in which we recognize the truth of who and what we are, that we are creating it all, essentially, and that these situations that we create, and I say, and this is a metaphysical perspective that I have, it takes a while to get into, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on that, but just from, as I often do at the beginning of the show, trying to explain metaphysics in 30 seconds or less is kind of tough. But basically the idea is that we are more than just our physical bodies, that we exist at a higher level. There is a higher level or dimension of ourselves that creates all that we experience in the world. And creates all that we experience in the world, including things that we might, in our smaller selves or our everyday selves, find to be puzzling, frustrating, anxiety-causing, and so forth and so on. But we are creating them at on a higher level, and we're creating them for our ability to experience and reconnect with the truth of what we are, to rise above, if you will, but more than that, to really recognize how powerful we are, how we are creating everything in the world, and that even experiences like loss and devastation and concepts of pain and feelings of lack, that these are illusions, that these are transient. They are not the truth of who and what we are. And then when we finally connect to it, we understand. And we understand on a level that is beyond what we might think of as regular comprehension. It's an understanding, a knowing. And there really isn't any loss, although we may have temporary feelings of this. They lead us to a place where we recognize how illusory they are. And I understand that, listening to me, some people are probably shaking their heads. But others who have had this experience, others who know, I think, get it. I certainly have heard from enough people who resonate to what I'm talking about here, to say that there is a truth beyond maybe what most people think of as reality. And I'll leave it at that because, I always come back to this subject every week, and we talk about it a little bit more. So, this week, our topic is on being alone, and the benefits of being alone, and what that means, and how some people have difficulty doing that, and how it's looked at sort of askance in our society. So we'll dive into that, and we'll talk about some wellness tips as well. But first, I wanted to get to the situation that happened in Florida, because this is a topical news show, and I never shy away or turn away from events like this. In fact, I talk about them quite a bit in relation to our perspective on this show, and the understanding that if we are creating these events in our world at this higher level that I was talking about, we are also creating events that seem to appear tragic, that seem to bring loss and feelings of pain and anger. And when we have situations like this that galvanize the attention of many people across the country and around the world, we are really trying to tell ourselves something. We are creating this situation to help us to really understand something. And understanding on many levels, including the idea of loss of loved ones, the idea of responsibility to each other, the idea of connectedness, and of course, as when each of these situations comes up, it also brings up discussions about guns and our relationship with them, and the need that we have somehow to hold on to firearms, to not only hold on to them, but stockpile them, to fight for the freedom to have them. And not to get into too much of a political debate here, but just to think about, what do guns represent? What do weapons represent? Well, weapons represent attack. Some would say defense. And in many ways, defense is another form of attack. Some would say protection. And then you might want to think about protection against what, and at what cost. These are all valid things to think about. More than anything, it seems to me that weapons, guns, represent fear. The use of a gun is almost always born out of fear, and that comes out of a feeling of powerlessness or lack of power that makes you feel afraid, that makes you feel vulnerable. And so the intensity of the debate about guns, the intensity of the and the stubbornness on the part of some to take precautions that could be potentially safeguarding lives, All of this is about fear. And fear often leads to anger. And there's, of course, the sense of frustration that these situations continue to reassert themselves in many different forms. 2018 is a little over 45 days old, and there have already been 29 mass shootings. So we're definitely trying to tell ourselves something. And it's a little bit like Groundhog Day, which I talked about earlier this month on this show, where, you experience the same thing over and over and over again until you learn how to make it go away, until you learn what you need to learn from it. And that's what comes to mind when I think about what's going on with these shootings. There's an article today about the people of Parkland, where this school shooting happened. And they are, there's a motivation happening. There's an action taking place among these people. Because as the title of the article says, and this article's in the Washington Post, by the way, people are angry. Pain turns political in Parkland after-school shooting. On a day when Parkland began burying its young dead, a dozen people stood on a street corner holding up more gun control signs as passing drivers honked and shouted support. This most peaceful and orderly of places has been devastated by the most violent and chaotic of acts. And amid the horse trails, bike paths, and gated communities of a city that prides itself on country elegance, the response to a shooting Wednesday that killed 17 people at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School has been a raw, growing, and furious burst of activism and demand for change. Hundreds of people filled the terrace of the Broward County Federal Courthouse on Saturday, where their echoing chants of "enough" and "not one more" weren't solemn, they were seething. None perhaps more so than Emma Gonzalez. And this young lady gave a very impassioned speech about the NRA and politicians who take money from them. And her anger filled this courtroom. And this is a young person who lost classmates in this high school. So what's happening here is an energy building. And yes, it is an energy building from anger. And it's an energy that is saying, enough is enough is enough. And it's interesting to see this, because this hasn't happened in any of the other school shootings. There's been remorse, there's been sadness, and there certainly have been comments about the need for better regulation. That all happened, in so many of these shootings. But this willingness, this desire to actually step forward and take action is pretty rare. So it remains to be seen. Maybe this is the time when we do that one thing that changes everything. When action is taken, when discussions are had,